Okay, it works when I tap, but not when I speak. Okay, now it works. Just quick check, James. The no swearing part, was that just for you, or does that include me? No. No. Do the best you can. I'll do the best I can. All right, awesome. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about my experience. I've titled the talk, Building an American Company with a Swedish Soul, which is something that we talk a lot about internally at Neo4j. The name of the company is Neo Technology, and the product that we produce is Neo4j. And we talk a lot about combining these two things, right? But I'm going to lead into it actually with what is going to end up being the main part of the talk, which is I've now run a startup in Sweden for 4 years, and I've run the same startup in Silicon Valley for 4 years. So I thought with a conference like this might be an interesting topic to reflect on what are the differences from my perspective. And then as a bonus, we're going to get into a little bit about how we're using our Scandinavian culture, or aspects of our Scandinavian culture, to gain a competitive advantage. So that's the topic. And before that, though, we're going to start with a little bit of a context, right? So we've actually been at this whole thing with databases for quite some time. In fact, we started out working on it in 2000 with a zero at the end, right? We spent 7 years building the technology internally at another company in Sweden, a small startup as well, that you haven't heard of. And then in 2007, we outsourced it, we spun out the IP and formed what's now called Neo Technology. We raised some money in 2009, and this was all back in Sweden. Then we focused a little bit on building a commercial foundation, and in 2011 we raised more money from an American investor based in New York, Fidelity. Moved the company over to Silicon Valley, and when I say move the company over, that doesn't mean that we moved everyone over. We kept engineering here in Europe, based out of Malmö, Sweden. We have a good crew here in London as well. But I moved over to San Mateo in the valley. And since then, we've focused on really making sure that it's taking off commercially. So at this point, we have 150 to 200 paying customers, 50,000 downloads per month, and all those good things, right? So that's sort of the context that I'm biased by. 4 years in Sweden, 4 years in Silicon Valley, right? Cool. All right, so reflections on running a startup in Sweden versus the Valley. So first off, I'm surprised no one has showed this. I think James alluded to it a little bit in one of his intros. But there was an analysis done by one of the big VC firms here in London, actually called Atomico. And they basically concluded that per capita, Stockholm is the second most productive, the second most successful at producing billion-dollar startups on the planet. It's just slightly after Silicon Valley, which I think is very interesting. Despite some of the things that we've talked about before, right? This is effective tax rates in Sweden and then in the US, with Silicon Valley as an example, right? Which is substantially higher, of course, in Sweden. If you look at tax burden as a percentage of GDP, you don't see the actual numbers here, but you can see Sweden is very, very, very high up on a chart like this, whereas United States is much, much, much lower, right? So that's kind of surprising, right? So the question is why? So this is based on a talk that I did actually a couple of years ago, and there's a lot of details in the slides, and I'm going to go through them very quickly. It's actually 2 45-minute talks that I'm now going to squeeze into this 18-minute slot. But the slides are actually online on my SlideShare. That goes into way more detail than I'm going to have time here. But I'm going to look at it along 5 axes. I decided to ignore fundraising and the whole VC game and investor game, even though that's a very important part of it. I decided to focus on the other aspects. So we're going to be looking at skill set, government and policy, culture, market, and then what I call nitty-gritty operations, actually running the company. And what has been the difference? Note the bias at the bottom bullet, right? Heavily enterprise software biased. because I'm informed by my background, right? First off, skill set, hacker skill set. When you run a software startup, this is probably the #1 most important thing, being able to attract amazing talent to your company, right? How's the Valley when it comes to hacker skill set? Well, it's extraordinary, right? The best hackers in the Valley are the best in the world. Not necessarily because they're the smartest, but they just have way more experience, right? They've been working at the Googles and the Facebooks, etc. of the world. They're also amazingly startup savvy, right? I can have a business level conversation, something which fills up way more of my time these days than it used to do, with a normal average hacker in Silicon Valley. And they're super sophisticated and very nuanced in their view about how not just building the technology, but getting it to market, right? From an adoption perspective, they're the earliest adopters and the most sophisticated early adopters on the planet today. In Sweden, the average skill is incredibly high. Very, very high average skill. I would say it's higher than the Valley, actually. So if you take a random engineer in Sweden and a random engineer in the Valley, it's typically the Swede will be better on average. So that's very good. It's informed by a couple of really interesting things. So when I grew up in the when I was a teenager, I guess, in the mid to late 90s, Sweden did this sort of crazy thing where they had the home PC reform, is what it was called, which basically was a way for any big company to be able to give their employees an ability to buy a home PC, as it was called back then, at a really affordable price and pay for it pre-tax, right? And in Sweden, typically the tax is, I mean, if you're making 20,000 or if you're making 30,000 Swedish kroners per month, right, then before taxes, you typically take home 20,000, right? So it's a significant thing, but you could pay for this before taxes, right? So it's a very, very advantageous thing. So all of my friends had this home PC thing brought home to that their parents bought for them, which ended up giving a very, very big PC penetration, right? Very high PC penetration, and which then also further led to very high broadband penetration, right? Which in like all the 90s and early 2000s, Sweden was top before Korea took it over, was top in these lists of broadband penetration. Mobile phones, this is something that I've learned since moving to the Valley. It's a very privileged situation in Scandinavia. I think the same is probably true of London as well. They actually work here, right? Which is, a surprise moving to the sort of epicenter where like basically mobile phones, I can't have a conversation commuting to my work, which is 20 minutes in my car. I now own a car for the first time in my life because I now live in the US. I can't have a single conversation during those 20 minutes, right? An uninterrupted conversation still, right? Which is pretty crazy. So mobile phones work in Scandinavia, which is a good thing. And then the final bullet there ends up being super important. One of the big challenges in Silicon Valley is that people move workplaces a lot, right? There's always this other startup who's way hotter than you are, which offers pre-IPO stock, which guaranteed is worth millions and millions of dollars with 100% certainty, right? And people jump around a lot. And I think the fact that, I don't know what it's like in London, but in Scandinavia, you end up, in general, sticking around much longer at one place. And the compounding effect of that is amazing. Right, so we started out hiring people in 2007 and 2008, right? And we still today have not lost a single engineer, like in the history of our company, right? We now have a 30-person engineering team, not a single engineer. That's a huge, huge compounding effect when it comes to team productivity. So that one is very big. When it comes to non-technical people, specifically mentors, I think that has been called out before when we talk about sort of other successful companies that have done the same thing as you do, and then they sell the company and they stick around and maybe they angel invest, but more importantly, they coach you, right? Silicon Valley is amazing here, right? They are the most skilled and have the most experience when it comes to software-based startups. But not only that, they are the most willing to share in the world, right? The famous paid forward culture, which is something that I don't think we're very good at in Sweden. And I try to do a lot of that. But if you multiply these two things, so the highest skill set and most experience times most willingness to share, it's just many orders of magnitude ahead of anywhere else on the planet, and definitely ahead of Sweden. We're pretty weak here. When I gave this talk 3 years ago, I said that none, they all suck, because if they didn't suck, they would be in London or in the Valley. That's not true anymore. Things are changing pretty rapidly here, and there's like a growing set of mentors and angel investors, etc. People who have done it before. So there's a community forming here, at least in Sweden and probably all over Scandinavia. And a lot has happened in the past couple of years. So that's a very positive change. Supposedly, America is the most pro-business land, on the planet. I've not experienced that at all. If anything, it's just been very pro-lawyer, and which is actually pretty horrible, right? I mean, my first couple of experiences with doing business in the US was horrible, right? I had a lawyer by my side in every single interaction I had with someone, and they had a lawyer on their side, right? And lawyers, and I say this with all kinds of love. My sister is a lawyer, and we rely on our lawyers and all that. But they can break shit so fucking fast. So freaking fast. Very, very fast. Okay, so fucking fast, good. And it's one of those things, I think one of the earlier speakers said something which I think is actually super fundamental to how Scandinavia differs from the Valley or from the US, which is trust, right? And nothing can break trust as fast as a lawyer, right? And so that part is actually a pretty significant drawback, I think, of doing business in the US. There's some drawbacks on a sort of legislative perspective or governmental perspective in Sweden, in particular around boring things like stock options, right? The tax effect of stock options, like you're just hearing that you want to fall asleep, right? But it ends up being really important, because what you want to do in this type of, when you run a high growth startup, is that you want everyone to have equity, right? And I don't necessarily mean that it has to be sort of on the financial upside, but you want everyone to belong, right? And be part of the success. And if that is complicated, or maybe not even especially advantageous, that's just friction in the process. So that's a drawback. The strong labor laws in Sweden. I grew up as a communist, like not like American Bill O'Reilly communist, like an actual real communist. So I'm actually a huge fan historically for strong labor laws, but I've now seen that from the other side and see what a drawback it is when it comes to the fact that I can't hire people until I know for sure that I'll be able to employ them forever. Right? There's this notion in the Valley where you talk about quick to hire and then quick to fire, which I don't subscribe to at all. I'm slow to hire and slow to fire. But in Sweden, I'm slow to hire and then never fire, because I basically can't fire people. And that's a really bad thing. Generally, though, I don't think that policy and governmental things move the needle all that much. Culture does do that, right? And here it's time for a new mic. It's part of this sort of standard routine. Like, you guys are practicing this, right? Everyone, there's a swap of the microphone, right? You live in an echo chamber where every single person works at a startup, right? You walk down to a cafe, right? And you sit down, and there's 14 people pitching their startups to other people, right? And some people go crazy by that. I love that. I mean, I think that I get energized by that, and I think that's a huge upside of being in the Valley. Sweden, not so much that. On the other hand, there's a little bit more of a focus on long-term sustainability when you build a company, and less focus on sort of quarter to quarter, kind of you need to hit your numbers every single quarter or you're going down. So I think that's a plus thing. Everyone told me that sort of fear of failure is a problem in Sweden. I've never experienced that, and When I started out, there wasn't as many entrepreneurs. That wasn't a problem either. And today, if anything, like entrepreneurship has boomed everywhere on the planet, and more so probably than in some other places in Scandinavia. Market's super strong in the Valley, right? So this is the harmonized US domestic market, which is the biggest market on the planet, right? So that's a super strong thing. Sweden, tiny domestic market, which is both good and bad. You know, there's 9 million Swedes, and I guess 5% of Finland speaks Swedish as well, right? But that's it, right? Which means that you can't stick around in Sweden. You have to build, like, if you want to build a big company, you need to move outside, right? And this is probably a good thing. And then nitty-gritty operations, so actually running the company. And here's, comes a little bit back to the trust thing. One of the things that I noticed moving to the US is that you're truly guilty until proven otherwise in America, right? So every time that I sign up a service provider, when for some reason you end up having a lot of service providers for your company in the US, every single time it's like I have to swipe my credit card before they start working with me. In Sweden, it's like we shake hands, they do work for 30 days or 60 days, then they send an invoice, and 90 days after that I pay it, and we're happy, right? Because we're shaking hands, right? And they've spent 4 or 5 months doing work, which I guess I could screw them over, right, and not pay them. But why would I, right? So there's this implicit trust that some of the previous talkers alluded to, which I think is sorely lacking in the US. And I think this comes back to the social fabric, right? The fact that it's just a more safer and secure environment. The big parental laws, you know, parental leave laws and strong labor laws. Here I think is an upside of that. Just in general, the social security safety net, I think, makes for a more trust-based environment. So that's sort of the key differences that I've seen so far after 4 years in Sweden and 4 years in the US. So the question then is, why do we have these disproportionate things, right? It's not clear to me after looking at the differences, but a couple of ideas, right? So we mentioned this one, small domestic market. We have to go outside. There's, you know, if you want to build something substantial, you can't build it for Sweden alone. So that's one thing. We talked about the high PC penetration and the broadband and then the mobile infrastructure. Generally speaking, Swedes have good English, right? Some local exceptions, but in general, Swedes have good English. I can say jump, yeah. That's okay, right? Jump, yeah. So that's good. So one Swede can say jump, right? And then, of course, what everyone comes back to is like the really cold winters. What are we going to do, right? We're going to sit at home and we're going to, you know, hack software. That's basically the only thing we can do 6 to 8 months per year, right? So those are some thoughts. And then really quickly, zooming in, actually, and not talking so general anymore, but talking specifically about our company. We've decided to focus on a couple of aspects of Scandinavian culture that we really fully embrace. And we try to talk about them a lot and try to act along them. And so this is actually a literal copy from our culture deck, which we have never shown publicly before, not because it's super top secret. You know, we probably should publish it. But here are some of the things two specific values that I picked out of our values that I think is a good representation of the combination of Scandinavian and American, right? So this is one of the things that I talk about a lot internally, right? I say, building an American company with a Swedish soul. So that's a cute line, right? But what does it mean? So despite my commie background, right? Real commie background, you know, when you interact with a lot of actual communists, like the most, like the objects of your admiration in general aren't big American companies, let's say. Despite that, I've actually always been a fan of big American companies. I think from some of the quotes from people in the audience, I think I may be the only person here that is a fan of big American companies. And there are so many things they do wrong, but at the same time, if you look at the Fortune 500, it's dominated by American companies, right? So we can all complain about how they're doing all these kind of things wrong, but in terms of impact and in terms of numbers, I mean, they clearly have figured out a way of executing very effectively, right? And so I want to marry the sort of aggressive and the ambitiousness and the effective execution of American companies with a more Scandinavian approach, and specifically an approach around how to treat our employees, right, our team members, a more humane approach to that, right? So the question then is, and this is always what I do when I talk about this internally, is that I say, so I'm influenced, of course, by my upbringing. So I'm going to give you a little example of the culture that I come from, right? So this is a quick movie clip that is going to hopefully give you some clue as to what we're talking about here. It's definitely not the Fantastic Four trailer. I just want to make sure that sound is working. But we're going to talk about this, and we're actually not going to show this clip, but this, just as way of background, this is a clip of the Supreme Commander of Sweden. Someone has, someone has attacked Sweden, and our forces are not, out there and meeting them because the Supreme Commander is on parental leave, right? And so they call him up. It's like, oh, what do you mean to do? It's like, sorry, I'm on parental leave. But that's not what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at, I think,
what's interesting is the Swedes are an extremely equal people. There are no hierarchies here. The Swedes prefer a so-called flat organization.
Okay, attack on my command! Yes, Captain. That is if you feel like it. I mean, I don't have to decide everything all the time. You want to make a decision?
Oh, maybe it's Ingrid's turn.
Okay.
Ingrid, do you want to attack?
I think we should have a group discussion about this.
That's a good idea!
We should bring in Lasse.
Yes!
Lasse, you want to attack?
It doesn't matter who you are, the same rules apply to everyone.
We have three main concerns to discuss with you.
Someone forgot to put this coffee cup in the dishwasher. Oh, it says Fredrik on it. Maybe it's yours, Fredrik.
But the dishwasher was full.
So you empty it. Your mother doesn't work here, Mr. Prime Minister.
Okay, you have to excuse me. I must attend to this.
Third time this week. What if Angela Merkel comes and then there are no fresh coffee cups?
The combination of sexual liberation and the fear of conflict make the Swede hard to provoke.
Look, my bike is messed up! Merde, I fucked your mother!
Oh, really? Oh, that's so good for her. She hadn't had much of a sex life. First, I thought you were angry with me, and now you come with this wonderful message.
In many ways, the Swedish people
So, 3 stories. I'm going to be addressing 2 of them. And the third one, the final one, we can talk later on over Aquavit, and I'll tell you lots of good stories about that one. But what did we see here? So we have 5 key values that we talk about, and this is number 2. We value consensus and intellectually honest discussions. I love this one because what I've found out is that in every single country outside of Sweden that I've interacted with, consensus is a bad word, right? And so it's a great one to lead with because it leads to all kinds of interesting discussions. And what is clear to me is that there's bad consensus, but there's also good consensus, right? And there are 2 different things. And we saw an example of bad consensus here, right? And what's bad consensus? It's you try to get consensus around a direction, but you don't, right? You deadlock, or you spend so much time arguing about it that you never execute, right? The example that we saw with the military forces that wanted to have a group discussion about whether to attack, right? We specifically counter that through 2 things. The first one is to have very clear decision-making, clear owners for every single decision, right? So for every single decision that happens at NEO, there's a very, very clear owner. And if there isn't, people should talk to me immediately, right? And at that point, I won't be able to tell them, but at least I'll tell them if it belongs to sales or marketing, and then they talk to the leader of that group, right? So clear owner for every single decision. And then that person has to narrowly define and scope the group in which you have a discussion which leads to consensus, right? So those two things actually manages to avoid the bad consensus that we see here. The upside of consensus is that we're hiring highly capable people, super smart, intrinsically motivated. They really want to work on Neo4j and build graph databases and help the world to make sense of data, which is our mission statement. And if the people who are going to execute on a particular task all agree that it's the best way to do it, and this is the best task for the company, execution is just so much more efficient, right? Because we haven't hired robots, right? So if you take the time to get consensus amongst that group, not the entire company, not have 80 people discuss which color we should use for XYZ, but have the 3-4 people who are going to execute on a particular task. If you have consensus amongst them, much more powerful and effective execution, right? So one example. The intellectually honest part, right? Consensus and intellectually honest discussions. I don't know, I'm sure there's a real definition of intellectually honest, but for me, intellectually honest discussions have a couple of components. One is that it's facts-based and uses logic. It's a rational discussion, facts plus logic. And the other one, which is really important, is that arguments are judged based on their merit, the argument itself, and not on its origin. And this comes back to the other thing, right? The prime minister who had to interrupt the meeting to go out and empty the dishwasher and put in his coffee cup, right? Which is something that I've learned after moving to America to emphasize and re-emphasize, which is that it is not only is it okay to challenge authority inside of our company, but I've learned that I have to strengthen that. It is not okay not to do that. You are required to do that. Part of your job description at Neo is to tell me that I'm full of shit, right? You need to do that, because I am full of shit, a lot of times, right? I found this interesting slide, which I have no idea at all what the scientific basis of this slide is. I don't know if you can see it, but you know, I did find it on the internet, so I'm sure it's true. But it basically says, should the boss have all the answers? And then it has a bunch of countries, which India leads at, I think 98% says, for this particular survey, said yes, right? And at the absolute bottom is Sweden, right? 7%. And I think one of the previous speakers alluded to that as well, right? And this is something that I really want to permeate all of Neo, right? Whoever is in charge fundamentally has to make a decision and very importantly decides the scoping of the discussion. How many people should he or she listen to, right? But they should be challenged. However, once a decision has been made, and in order to make sure that we don't get caught in the bad consensus, the deadlock part, we have this saying, which I'm sure you've heard, the disagree and then commit, right? Once a decision has been made through our decision-making process, you commit to that. It doesn't matter if you agreed or if you disagreed. Once a decision has been made, it's done, and we execute, right? So those are some thoughts around the differences of running a startup in Sweden versus the Valley, and how we've been able to take some of the values from our Scandinavian upbringing and bringing them into our American company, try to fill it with a Swedish soul. And so I tried to think, what sort of are the conclusions from this? And I think one thing that I sort of thought about, which may be a conclusion, was, if you embrace different cultures in your company, you can merge them into something that ends up being a freaky new thing, but may also end up being something really beautiful. But I thought that sounded way too meta and fluffy. So I figured that's not the conclusion. So maybe the conclusion is, if someone says, fuck your mother, you should just embrace that and hug them. And so maybe that's the conclusion. Unclear. I don't know what the conclusion is, but yeah. However, we're hiring in Malmö, in London, and Silicon Valley. We'd love to work with you. And that's it. That's all from me. Thank you very much.